welcome back. Now, while the jury is still out on South Africa's inclusion in AGOA, there is a positive development. The U.S. has agreed to revive the bilateral trade and investment framework agreement with the country. This agreement sets out strategic frameworks and principles for dialogue and trade and investment issues with the U.S. Jon Foster-Pedley, who's Dean and Director of the Henley Business School Africa and Chair of the African Association of Business Schools, joins us with greater perspective this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Tando. Pleasure.
Wonderful. I'm keen maybe to speak about, before we get into, the revival of what we're seeing here with trade talks, relations between ourselves and the U.S. On the mend, can we say?
Well, that's a philosophical question, isn't it? It depends who wins the election, I would say,
Yeah.
really. You're going to have two very different agreements. Personally, I would prefer to have Harris around, but that's just an opinion. So I think it really depends which way we're going. With Trump, we're going to have a lot more negotiation. The agreements we have with other countries that the government is pursuing, perhaps with Russia or even Iran and China, may make it very problematic for our relations with the US. But we'll see. And I think we need to change. Maybe with a Harris administration, it'll be easier too.
We have sent this delegation through now to Washington to negotiate various things on our behalf. And what has emerged then are conversations around reviving the bilateral trade and investment framework agreement. Can you help us understand exactly what this framework does for us and why it would be beneficial for us here in South Africa?
Right. I mean, it's quite confusing, isn't it? You've got AGOA, you've got the African free trade thing, you've got these trade and investment frameworks. But I think the way too easy to understand it is that trade and investment frameworks are, as I agree, and I'm not a trade specialist, so I speak under some correction here. I'm a business school dean. But the TIFAs are agreements, complementary agreements for dialogue and cooperation on trade and investment issues to let you have discussions on economic matters, normally between the USA and individual countries, let's say. And so they're more like strategic dialogue agreements, which set the framework for something else. So that is why the TIFA is interesting, but it has plus and minuses for us, which we can go into later. By contrast, the African Growth and Opportunity Act specifically offers preferential access to US markets for eligible sub-Saharan countries, of which we're one, enabling them to export thousands of products tariff-free. And they enhance trade relations by getting decent strategic dialogue through the trade and investment framework agreements with the tangible trade benefits through AGOA. The challenge there is that the TIFAs often require you to have a reciprocal lowering of tariffs for products coming into South Africa. And they cover a broader range of countries sometimes. And so the AGOA covers a broader range of countries. So you've got some difficulty in negotiation here. So it's a tricky balance.
And of course, then we must speak about the pros and cons, as you've mentioned, because it really matters, specifically as it's going to, of course, work alongside AGOA, if all things go well here. And it might, like you say, just create maybe a bit of a confusing environment.
Yeah. Look, if we get involved if we revive the trade and investment framework agreement, you're likely to have much better access to US markets, South African companies. That's great. That'll help job creation in South Africa for export sectors, I guess manufacturing, agriculture, etc. And local industries can get more jobs because you're getting access to the US markets. That's wonderful, particularly labor-intensive markets, perhaps. That'll help skills development, so we'll be able to build sectors. That's very encouraging, build employment. And it'll allow us to diversify to export markets from South Africa, as it were, to the US. And that'll help, I guess, better economic, better political ties, etc. The AGOA thing is a little bit different because AGOA requires you to have a wider range of engagement. So you'll be dealing with SACU, for example. You'll be having to have agreements with a range of countries, just because you can't negotiate similarly just from one country to another. You've got to quite often negotiate for a range of countries that are included in AGOA. Which means that you can't necessarily put your own incentives first. You've got to actually allow what's needed for the other countries to be included in your negotiation. And that becomes difficult because, whose will gets the, are we doing this for Namibia? Are we doing it for other countries in the Act? Are we doing it for ourselves? So the negotiation landscape becomes a lot more difficult around AGOA. So I think we have to be careful about how we engage with these, not get too optimistic about it, and understand that we're all going to have to be working closely together, businesses and government, to get the best benefits for us in these agreements.
Also interesting here, I guess, is all of this conversation with AGOA, or, if we speak of the TIFAs, even with the African Continental Free Trade Order, they all actually, these conversations gain some momentum at a time when it sounds like the world is very interested in, looking inward. Countries are maybe, less keen on, trading with others, or even being tolerant of one another. And I'm wondering if this is also a complexity we should anticipate as South Africa, that the world is just a little bit more complex than what might have been maybe 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, it's growing. The geopolitical power blocks are changing, as we well know. You've got much more inward-looking, sort of America first. I mean, if you compare how a Trump election victory might be different from a Harris victory, if you look at AGOA, Trump's been skeptical about AGOA in the past, and it may not be renewed, for example, because of the disagreements about what happened with the Russian ships, or whatever happened there. We're still not quite sure, or our closeness to Russia, or other actors which may not be in his view, in America's interest. So the America First approach might even exclude us from that. Let's hope not. The Trump administration would give greater pressure on us. They would leverage AGOA to influence South African policy decisions. Well, that's tricky. Maybe use trade benefits to pressure our country into aligning more closely with US interests, against our interests with China, for example. And it could create a lot of uncertainty for US businesses who are reliant on AGOA's tariff-free access to US markets. TIFA may face challenges as well under Trump presidency, because they might prioritize bilateral trade that favor US interests, and might limit the scope of relations and negotiations that we could expect from TIFA, particularly if we're seen as a less favorable trading partner. And Trump's approach might lead to sudden or unexpected significant shifts in policy, for example, and more aggression on trade negotiations, which may mean we get less favorable terms for South Africa with the US. And that's tricky for us. And so there's a lot of long-term uncertainty. Whereas if Harris won, you would expect that Harris might be more committed to AGOA, which gives tariff-free access to African countries, including South Africa, eligible African countries. And so we would expect that AGOA to continue. Harris may prioritize strengthening TIFA as a framework for enhancing trade relations. This would be more robust discussions around trade barriers, investment opportunities, etc. And we might find that the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements may emphasize the importance of regional trade agreements rather than bilateral ones. So you can imagine the complexity that poor negotiators are going to have to go through with this. We in business just want a level playing field that's easy, beneficial to us, access to the US markets, and let's get on with business. But of course, the geopolitics and the changing nature of politics in not only the US, but Europe and elsewhere means that we are faced with a lot of uncertainty. I think South African businesses need to be quite robust and resilient and very shrewd in their negotiations, and very, very resilient, because it's going to be a changing playing field for us, I'm quite sure.
Sounds like we've got a second mini election on the horizon for ourselves here. And thank you so much, Prof. An absolute pleasure having you with us this afternoon. That was Jon Foster-Pedley, Dean and Director of the Henley Business School Africa and Chair of the African Association of Business Schools.